And I don't know how many of you here, July 4th of 2018, when Sherry Bruner and Patty Campbell did the 4th of July, they did a duet on the pianos, and I'm telling you, it was so emotional that we just kind of floated out of here that day. That was a great show. This morning, at the earlier church, we sang happy birthday to an 80-year-old lady. And so I said to her, you brought back a lot of memories to me. I remember when I used to think 80 was old. George Washington, one of the greatest Americans ever, maybe the greatest. I'm sure we would not have won the Revolutionary War without George Washington. And after he served 2 terms as our first president, he was so well thought of, so respected, so admired, they asked him if he would serve a 3rd term, but he refused. But the reason I mention George Washington is because George Washington said, and I quote, "It is impossible to rightly govern a country without God and the Bible." It is impossible to rightly govern a country without God and the Bible. And I want to talk a little bit about the Bible this morning, a little history of the Bible. Now, the very first words written that are now in the Bible were written around 1300 BC. That's when God was giving Moses the 10 Commandments. They were written in Hebrew. That was Moses' language. So if you read Exodus 20 and you read the Ten Commandments, you're reading words that were written about 3,200, 3,300 years ago. Now, before the printing press, it would take about 3 years to copy one Bible. And there were people who did that for a living. But can you imagine how tedious that was? Every day for 3 years, page by page, copying the Bible. And if they made one little mistake, they'd have to start that page over. And it was written on sheepskin. And they would take 300 sheep for each Bible. So needless to say, the Bible was very expensive. And needless to say, very few families owned the Bible. But by 300 AD, the Bible was written into a number of different languages. Now, the Old Testament has 39 books. It was written over a period of 1,000 years, completed 400 BC. The New Testament was written after the death of Jesus. It had 27 books, completed 100 AD. And between the New Testament and the Old Testament, there were 40 different writers. So you have 66 books written over a period of 1,500 years, 40 different writers, and not one word of contradiction, not even one. So surely the Bible was inspired by the Holy Spirit. Surely the Bible is the Word of God. Now, the early churches were started by the apostles shortly after the death of Jesus. Apostle Paul gets a lot of credit, but number one, he was a Roman citizen. And as a Roman citizen, he had certain privileges that the other apostles did not have. He had more freedom to do what he wanted to do. And number two, his primary mission was to teach and convert Gentiles to Christianity. And he was relentless in that, and he was very successful. But those were tough times. Those were really, really tough times. Even though the Roman Empire had control of the Jewish nation, they depended on the Pharisees to help keep the Jews in line. So they would appease the Pharisees. So during that period of time, hundreds and hundreds of Christian Jews were executed, many with the help of the Roman soldiers. Sorry about that. Now, did I just say every one of the apostles was executed with the exception of John? John died natural causes of an old age. So this kind of went on for about 300 years. And then in the early 300s, the Constantine made the Christianity the official religion. So this is rather interesting. They go from persecuting Christian Jews to making Christianity their official religion. There was 3 pagan religions in Rome at this time. None of them very popular. And the Roman citizens were searching. They were looking for a new religion. They were not happy with the pagan religions. And so even after the execution of Paul, Christianity continued to grow, and it also grew among the Roman soldiers. Then in 380 AD, Caesar Augustus built a church. He was not a Christian himself, but he had come to the conclusion that if Rome had a church, they would be a stronger nation. And of course, he knew what was going on with Christianity among the Roman citizens. And he appointed to the church Christians in the leadership positions. And so the church began to grow, and the church did grow. The church became pretty powerful. And that was the beginning of the Roman Catholic Church. And they became so powerful, so political, that anyone that crossed a challenge to the Roman Catholic Church could be immediately executed. And a number of people were. Then I would say, not only that, he banned all the pagan religions. And so this went on for about 1,100 years. And during that 1,100 years, anyone who translated the Bible in any language other than Latin would be executed. That was a serious crime. The Roman Catholic Church only wanted people to know what was in the Bible, what they wanted them to know. But then around 1381, for the first time, the Bible was translated in English. It was translated by John Wycliffe. You can buy John Wycliffe Bibles today. John Wycliffe was a professor at Oxford University, and so where he was kind of untouchable by the Roman Empire. And so this went on for around 1100 years. But then it all began to change in the 1400s. In 1450 AD, a German by the name of Johann Gutenberg invented the printing press. And now all of a sudden, the populace are exposed to written materials, and many of the written materials were written by Bible scholars who had already began to question the integrity and the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. And the very first book mass-produced by the printing press was the Bible. And the Bible has been the best-selling book every year since that time. You know, I'm sorry, I'm hesitating some this morning. It's not anything I had a problem with earlier. But anyway, because of the availability of the Bible, that encouraged private devotion away from the Roman Catholic Church. And it encouraged Bible studies in people's homes. And so people beginning to learn what's in the Bible for themselves. So now we have the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Now we have the beginning of new and different Protestant churches. And one of the very first Protestant churches was the Presbyterian. And the Presbyterian really got started in 1541 in Scotland under the leadership of John Knox. And it soon spread to Ireland. And when the Irish and the Scottish came to America in the early 1600s to begin their new life, they brought with them the Presbyterian faith. And one of the first Presbyterian churches in America was in 1706 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which is where things were happening at that time. And in 1746, the Presbyterian Church founded Princeton University. And the president of Princeton University was John Witherspoon. And John Witherspoon was the only minister to sign the Declaration of Independence. Well, in 1727, Charles and John Wesley came to America via Savannah, Georgia, bringing the Methodist faith. And their initial mission was to convert the American Indians to Christianity. And it really began to grow. They started hiring circuit riders to ride through the rural parts of America, starting Methodist churches. And at one time, there were 4,400 circuit riders riding through the rural parts of America, starting Methodist churches. And so during that time, the Methodist was the largest Protestant denomination in America. And you may be interested in knowing that the very first church in Highlands was a Methodist church. The second was the Presbyterian. Now, the Presbyterians are in their original building, so sometimes they say that it's the oldest church in Highlands. Well, it is the oldest building in Highlands, but really the Methodist is the first church. And the Methodists used to be where the Baptists are located today. In the early 1900s, they sold that building to the Baptists for $500, and they started building this church here. So this church here was started somewhere in like 1905, 1906. I think it was completed in 1909. And at that time, it was just one large frame building, and nothing was in there but a wood-burning, pot-bellied stove. They didn't even have any bathrooms. And at that time, Main Street was a dirt road, and the church was right down near the dirt road, and right next to it was a cornfield. And for those of you who have never seen it, I got a photograph of it. This was the first church built and I think completed in 1909, which was nothing but a frame building right down on the road. Well, in 1950, when they decided to renovate the church, the first thing they did was put logs under the church and move the church building back where we are today. And we are in the same building. This is the building right here. I look around and I see members of this church whose grandparents helped build this church. And just one example was Terry Crow, who was then Terry Picklesheimer, and her grandfather is the one who was in charge of putting the stone around the church. And of course, they added a few bathrooms. This over here was known as the chapel, and it was a separate room with a separate entrance. And so they used the chapel for events like weddings and so forth. So you know now a little bit of history of the Methodist Church and a little bit of the Protestant denomination. I'm going to quote you Psalm 100, verse 5. For the Lord is good, his mercy is everlasting, and his truth will endure all generations. In other words, his truth will last forever, and the Bible will last forever. Not only is the Bible the best-selling book every year, for the past 2 years, it's been the best-selling book in Norway, which is not even known to be a Christian nation. Some of you may know who Bill Bright was. Bill Bright was the founder of Campus Crusade for Christ. He was born in Coweta, Oklahoma, October 19, 1921. He was the fourth child of the marriage, and during his mother's pregnancy, things were not going well. Things were not going well at all, and the doctor was afraid that the baby, or maybe her too, would not survive the birth, and so they encouraged her to have an abortion. But she refused. She was a strong Christian lady. She prayed every day that if God would let her baby live, she would dedicate her baby's life to God. Well, Bill Bright did live, and he didn't find out till many, many years later that his life had been dedicated to God. He grew up on a ranch with his parents and grandparents, and both his mother and grandfather were very strong church-going women, but his father and grandfather, even though they were highly ethical, moral men, they kind of thought church was for the women folks, and that's about the way Bill Bright grew up. But after he graduated from college, he ended up, of all places, Hollywood, California, and he got involved in the food distributive business. And as a favor to a friend of his who he deeply admired, he started attending the First Presbyterian Church of Hollywood, and he soon joined and became quite active. And because he became so active, he had the opportunity to get and to know Billy Graham real well, who was also, of course, a young man at that time. And he shared with Billy Graham that he would like to get into ministry full time. Well, Billy Graham suggested to him that he should get involved with college kids because there was a real need and no one was doing it. So in 1953, he sold his business for a substantial amount of money, used all the proceeds to start Campus Crusade for Christ. His first college was UCLA, where he started with 4 students. Well, today, Campus Crusade for Life is in over 1,700 colleges throughout America and some of the other parts of the world. They got around 5,000 full-time staff and maybe 225, 250 volunteers. Well, around 2001, as Bill Bright's health's beginning to fail, he's in a wheelchair. He has to have oxygen everywhere he goes, and the doctor gave him 6 months to live. So he decided he was going to use his 6 months to be just as active as he possibly could. Well, he ended up living 2 years, but he was very active. He wrote a couple of books, and he was constantly on the speaking tour. And he said 2 things before he died that really stayed with me. One, he said the last 2 years of his life were the most productive, the most heartwarming years of his life. He thought they were the most creative years of his life. And secondly, he said that if your heart is right, after adversity come great blessings. If your heart is right, after adversity come great blessings. Well, Jane and I were remodeling our home here in Highlands a few years back, and we were down in Lowe's doing some shopping, and the guy waiting on us one of the nicest guys you'd ever want to wait on you. We could tell he was special because every time somebody that worked at Lowe's came by, they would call him by name and have something nice to say to him. But what was different about this guy, he was in a wheelchair and both his legs were missing from the top of his thighs down. So finally I said to him, I said, David, what happened to your legs? And he said, stupidity. I said, stupidity? I don't understand. He said, well, I was out drinking one night, had way too much to drink, and I got on my motorcycle, and I was in a terrible accident. He said, I not only lost both my legs, he said, I am paralyzed from the bottom of my chest down. And I said, David, that is horrible. That's so bad. I feel so badly for you. He said, well, don't feel bad for me. I said, really? Why is that? He said, well, this happened about 5 years ago. At the time, my little boy was 6 years old. My little girl was 6 months old. But he says, I was not being a good father. I was not being a good husband. He said, I was not even living at home. He said, I was out drinking and running around every night. He said, when I woke up in the hospital and realized what happened, I saw my wife standing down at the end of the bed. And I blurted out to her, why are you here? Why would you want to be here with me now? And she said, well, David, I love you. I will always love you. And right then he said he knew he was the luckiest guy in the world. And just about that time, the cutest little girl you'd ever want to see, I guess she was 5 or 6 years old, she comes running in the store. She jumps up in his lap. She throws her arms around his neck, gives him a hug and a kiss on the cheek, and she said, Daddy, I love you. And he looked up at us. He said, you know, it's time for my break. I want to spend it with my family. And, of course, we said, sure. So he and his little girl go taking off to the break room in the wheelchair. And it just made me think about what Bill Bright said, if your heart is right after adversity, come great blessings. And I had an opportunity to speak to David Posey a few years ago. He was no longer working at Lowe's. He was going to college full time. He wanted to be a counselor and work with kids who were having problems. I'll close with one short story. I've told this story a number of years ago. Most of you haven't heard it, and the ones that have probably forgot it. And I understand that. But a number of years ago, I was invited to speak to the Swan Quarter, North Carolina Chamber of Commerce. Now, at first I declined. I never heard of Swan Quarter, North Carolina, and to get to Swan Quarter, North Carolina from Orlando, which is where I was at the time, was an all-day trip. I had to fly into Charlotte, North Carolina, spend 3 hours in the airport, and then fly to Greenville, North Carolina. Then I had over an hour's drive. But it turned out to be my most memorable trip. Swan Quarter, North Carolina is a very small commercial fishing and farming community located on the banks of the Pamlico Sound. Now, the Pamlico Sound eventually goes on out to the Atlantic Ocean, to Cape Hatteras and Nags Head, which is known as the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Swan Quarter is known as the Inner Banks of North Carolina. Swan Quarter is the county seat for Hyde County. Hyde County may be the largest county in North Carolina, but it also may have the smallest population. They don't even have 5,000 people in the entire county. They don't even have one traffic light in the entire county. But Hyde County is also the home of the largest natural lake in North Carolina, Lake Matamuskeet. And Lake Matamuskeet is a wildlife preserve. And at certain times of the year, there's so many ducks, geese, and wild swan on the lake, you can hardly see the water. Henceforth, the name Swan Quarter. Now, Swan Quarter has been hit by 2 major hurricanes. I'm not sure about this last hurricane. I don't have all the information, but the last one that I know of was in 2003, Hurricane Isabel. And a number of homes were totally destroyed, and many businesses were severely damaged. Swan Quarter has also been hit by a number of floods. And because of the floods, many homes are built up on stilts. And also because of the floods, today there is a dike that separates Swan Quarter from the Pamlico Sound. Now, Swan Quarter was settled back in the 1700s. And in 1875, a group of Methodists decided they wanted to build a new church in downtown Swan Quarter. The property they wanted to buy was owned by Mr. Sam Sadler. And Mr. Sadler did not want to sell his property. And the more the church tried to buy the property, the more determined Mr. Sadler was not to sell. So finally, the church buys another piece of property located about a block and a half from Mr. Sadler's, and they build their new church. And on September the 15th, 1875, they had a dedication of the new church, and they named the new church First Methodist Church of Swan Quarter, North Carolina. But 3 days later, there's a flood. The flood waters pick up the church and start floating the church right down Main Street of Swan Quarter. Miss Lily Bren, who grew up in Swan Quarter, was standing in her kitchen looking out her kitchen window. And she sees the church float right past her house. She watches it take a left, go down about a block and a half, and sit right down on the property owned by Mr. Sam Sadler. Mr. Sadler is so in awe, he gives the property to the church. They changed the name of the church from First Methodist Church of Swan Quarter to the Providence Methodist Church of Swan Quarter. And I had an opportunity to visit this church. It is still one of the most active churches in Swan Quarter today. And when you walk in the entrance of the church, there's a sign right above the door that says, "The church that was moved by the hand of God." True story. I'll leave you with two thoughts. Those who bring sunshine into the life of others cannot keep it from themselves. And if you're really looking to sing, really looking to sing, you can always find a song. Thank you, and God bless. Thank you.